Imagine a budding Victorian-era naturalist who, after an epic voyage around the world, comes up with a big idea that he thought would decisively settle one of the great issues of the day. It would provide a comprehensive, naturalistic explanation of the origin of the varieties of life on Earth. But imagine still that after committing several discursive versions of it to paper, the last, a 200 plus page treatise full of evidence and argument, this ambitious gentleman scholar shelves it to work on other topics. And despite a strong proprietary attachment to his big idea as a revolutionary theory, an opinion that we would all later share, he does not place it in the public domain for nearly 20 years. As we know, this was not some scenario concocted in a creative writing workshop. It was exactly what mid-20th century historians of science, the progenitors of today's Darwin industry, were faced with when they turned their attention to the history of Darwin's big ideas. Darwin scholars then latched on to the key evidential elements of the story, the private notebooks that showed the development of his theorizing in the late 1830s, and the successive unpublished versions of it that were transcribed in the early 1840s, well before he finally went public in 1858. It was an intriguing facet of Darwin's career. A succession of scholars discerned what they perceived as a hesitation to publish. The question then became, what stopped the reluctant Mr. Darwin? A range of answers were proffered, some quite conservative and plausible, others more fanciful and elaborate. However, the delay's status as an accepted verity coloured almost every portrait of the man from the 1950s onwards. The Beagle arrived back in England on the 2nd of October 1836. Darwin immediately reunited with his family and gets his land legs back. He's now completely forgotten about entering the clergy and attempts to establish himself as a scientist. He goes out and about London where he has lodgings, forging connections around him. Fortuitously, he meets Charles Lyell, the principal geologist of his day. Lyell has already been impressed by Darwin's work and is anxious to help him get along. He sees in Darwin a possible ally for his uniformitarian geology and introduces Darwin to the Geological Society, where Darwin rapidly climbs up the rungs to become secretary. And all the while he's thinking about what he has seen, trying to piece it together. At some point since leaving Australia in the early part of 1836, he has become converted to transmutation. But of course, he has told nobody. Instead, in mid-July 1837, he opens a new secret notebook, Notebook B, which he entitles Zunamia. In this notebook, he'll start jotting down his ideas, attempting to develop them, attempting to build upon his Malthusian view of the kingdom of nature. Soon, Notebook B turns into Notebook C, which turns into Notebook D, his ideas evolving about natural selection and about the notion of common descent. At 28 years old, Darwin is still a relatively young man, and he's a bachelor, and quite clearly marriage is on his mind. He decides that the woman for him is his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, and she accepts his proposal with alacrity, and they're married on the 29th of January 1839. Emma is a devout woman, a Unitarian by background. Darwin immediately makes her aware of his own doubts and his beliefs about the universe. He doesn't want anything to be between them. In fact, Emma may have been the first person that he told about his heretical scientific views. And and her worries that in the afterlife they may not meet again, Emma remains a resolute supporter of Darwin, standing by his side, bringing up his family, helping to edit his works. In 1842, Darwin's growing family moved from the city to Down House in Kent. It is a rural retreat some 15 miles from the city, a place where the Darwins can get away from the stresses and strains of urban life, a place where Darwin can think in peace. Increasingly, he will stay put at Down, inviting fellow scientists to visit him for weekends, writing to his vast network of correspondence, carrying out day to day his writing and his experiments and his thinking, but as far as possible not travelling anywhere unless it involved his health. Much of his time is spent trying to sort out the remainder of the Beagle collections, but he's also constantly thinking about his theory of transmutation. In 1842, he commits to paper a 30-page essay sketching out natural selection and common descent. Soon after, Darwin would renew his relationship with Joseph Dalton Hooker, who he had met just before Hooker had gone off on Ross's Antarctic expedition as a ship's surgeon. On renewing their acquaintance, they formed a really close bond, and it would be to Hooker that Darwin would make his confession of 1844 that he was working on transmutation and that it seemed like committing. Some months after this confession, Darwin would complete a 230-page essay. Theoretically, it has come on in leaps and bounds. In fact, the major elements of what would be published in Origin were already in place. He even paid the local schoolmaster to copy it out and then sealed it in an envelope, telling his wife Emma that if he should die, that it should be sent off to an editor who would treat it sympathetically and published. As Janet Brown acerbically comments, there could only be one reason for this. He would rather be dead than to have his theory go public. A few months later, in October 1844, Transmutation takes centre stage with the anonymous publication of Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. Vestiges portrayed an enormously old universe. It also put the idea forward that transmutation was at the heart of speciation. The mechanism it proposed was distinctly Lamarckian, and yet there was a respectability to it, as Mr. Vestiges, as the anonymous writer was known at the time, also put forward the idea that a god had drawn up the rules for the universe. It causes a veritable sensation. Everybody who is anybody is reading it, even Queen Victoria and her husband Prince Albert. Many of the reviews in the popular journals were ecstatic. It seemed to be the very epitome of progress. At first, Darwin was myth, while most of the people around him were deeply amused by it. Hooker, in particular, enjoyed poking fun at Darwin over the matter of vestiges. But for Darwin, it seemed as if someone had trespassed on his very own territory. But annoyance would rapidly turn to terror when Darwin read and was deeply shocked by the ferocity of Adam Sedgwick's review in the Edinburgh Review for July 1845. Sedgwick was Professor of Geology at Cambridge and had also been something of a mentor to the young Charles Darwin when he was studying at Cambridge. They'd even been on a field trip to Snowdonia, where Sedgwick had taught him the elements of practical geology. As Darwin said in one of his letters, I read it with fear and trembling. Some would say that the opposition of people like Adam Sedgwick was a major break to Darwin developing his species theories. And even into the 1850s, he was concerned about his reputation with people like his old mentor. However, before we get to that point, we have to deal with the issue of the barnacles, an episode that dragged on and on and on and seemed to take Darwin further and further away from his species work. If we're to properly understand the delay, we also have to have an understanding of the barnacle's work, and it is to this that we now turn.